Hello and welcome to the podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the organisation that's been the face of communal living in Britain since the 1980s. Whatever kind of intentional community you're interested in, whether it's communes, co-ops, co-housing or anything else, Diggers and Dreamers is where you begin. And now, here's our podcast host, Kirsten Stevens-Wood.
Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of the Diggers and Dreamers podcast. I had the pleasure of speaking with David Harris, who is a resident and archivist from the extraordinary community called Whiteway Colony. These guys have been around since 1898 and have done pretty much everything that communes do. Run a school, set up a craft shop, set up their own swimming pool, and that doesn't even scratch the surface. Their origin story has some especially unusual and anarchic moments that David will share with us. He also talks about intrusions from spies, some very extreme forms of sharing in the early years, and accusations of the community's beastly morals. It really was such a treat to speak with David, and I'm sure you'll enjoy hearing what he has to say. Okay, on to the show. We're extremely lucky today to have a guest with us who is from something called the Whiteway community. So Whiteway community actually celebrated their 125th birthday back at the end of 2023. And today's guest is David from Whiteway community, who is not only a resident, but also a resident archivist for Whiteway. Welcome, David. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Hello, yes, as you said, and thank you very much for the introduction. My name's David. I've been living in Whiteway Colony, which is located in the Cotswolds in southern England. I've been living here since 1997. I've always wanted to take an active part in this community, and recently that's led to me becoming secretary to our meeting. And as a development of that, being secretary, of course, involves, looking after records of meetings and things like that. And I've also become, as you say, archivist, looking after older material as well as recent documents. And
Fantastic.
took that over from an earlier archivist called Joy Thacker, who worked on it for many years and collected a lot of historical material, which he put into a book back in the 1990s.
Yes, I think I've seen copies of that book. As I might have said to you earlier, I've yet to get my hands on one myself, but I thought you might be able to give us a bit of a potted history of Whiteway, their sort of founders and how they got set up, and maybe take us through that journey into today.
Yes, of course. Like you said earlier, we've just celebrated our 125th anniversary, and Whiteway started in 1898. Therefore, so a long time ago by my reckoning, and it came out of a group called the Brotherhood Church, who started up following the ideas of Tolstoy, and was originally based in London. And this group used to be, despite the name church, you might think this was very evangelical, although it had Christian ideas. It was very welcoming to people of various views, and as I said, inspired by Tolstoy's ideas, and they set up a community over in Essex in southern England. Following a disagreement amongst some members of that community, disagreements are not uncommon in communities, and I think anyone who's experienced this area will know. Specifically, this was actually about the the thing that led to them leaving was actually about the inclusivity of the community, because a couple of people had applied to join and they'd been rejected by the community meeting in Purley. They were perhaps seen as the wrong sort of people. I don't really know. But whatever the reason, this really angered some members of the community at the time. And that was the impetus that led them to then say, well, we want to set up now our own community inspired by the same ideas, but we want to welcome all people, provided they're willing to join us in a spirit of goodwill, and be part of our group. And that led to them founding Whiteway Colony.
Did I read that there was Tolstoy, or at least influences of Tolstoy in some of that early ideology that drove the community?
Yes, definitely. They were believers in Tolstoy's ideas. One of the people connected with the community had even been to visit Tolstoy in Russia.
Oh, wow.
And they were very much of the view that the right thing to do was the simple life, everyone working to produce what they needed for themselves. And as I said, a driving principle always to live in this kind of idea of goodwill and freedom. So they then, one of them had inherited a little bit of money, so that enabled them traveling around. They looked in various places, but a group of them eventually discovered this little piece of land here in the Cotswolds, about 40 acres, and they were then in a position to buy that land with this legacy.
Such really interesting roots, and as I didn't know about the visit to Russia, which probably would have been quite controversial at the time. But also, we quite often hear Whiteway referred to as the anarchist community. And I wondered how those links came into place as well, because a lot of people make links between anarchism and chaos, whereas my familiarity with anarchism is more linked to things like ideas of freedom, which you've referred to already. Did you see any of that in the early formation of Whiteway?
Yes, definitely. And as you say, anarchism here just means the absence of rigid hierarchical authority. And that was one of the things that really linked the original colonists together in a common thinking, even though they might have differed. Some, were certainly Christians from that Brotherhood Church background. Some were Quakers, but some were not Christians or followers of any particular known religion. But they shared this view about individual freedom and trusting people to be able to make decisions for themselves without having to be ruled by an authority. And of course, sometimes difficult for us to appreciate in the way we're brought up in England anyway, with the democratic process. They don't accept the rule of the majority over the minority. So, as you know, the principle of democracy that we're brought up with is you have a vote, and that vote will have a winner and a loser, and the winner is the one who gets to decide. But that is emphatically rejected by the philosophy of anarchism, and certainly the people who came to Whiteway. They would regard that as the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah, we're all familiar with that one. And actually, that ties in really nicely with when we came to your 125th anniversary. it was really interesting to see you reenacting those early days through the act of burning the title deeds. I wondered if you could maybe tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, well, of course, that's another of the philosophical ideas shared by the early people, was rejection of the idea that property could be owned, and used as a source of profit. So, in those days, most people didn't own land, they were paying rent. The term landlordism was commonly used at that time, and this was something very much rejected by the founders. So although they did have some money and were able to use that to buy this land, they did not want to be entered on the title deeds as owners of the land, because they just didn't believe in the idea of ownership. And I think you remember me explaining in the little talk I gave at the anniversary celebration, there was a somewhat, almost, I'd say, comical scene that occurred when it turned out somebody had to sign these deeds, and they in the end said, well, I'll sign if you sign, I'll sign if you sign as well. Eventually a number of them did sign, but only on condition that immediately the document was prepared, it should be put in the flames and burnt, because they wanted to reject the idea of ownership of the land. And they burnt it ceremonially, declaring that the land would never again revert to private hands. And that's something we reenact when we have one of our celebrations to mark the founding of the colony.
I love the idea that people, we always think of sort of radical politics and protest as being a modern phenomenon that's been invented today. And yet when we look back, there's these amazing examples of people doing quite incredibly different things, like burning the deeds in order to sort of really live out their beliefs and their political persuasions. I think, it's quite remarkable. And so I guess the other question that links to the burning of the deeds is also, how has that in itself played out in terms of the community? Because of course 125 years is a long time, and quite a lot will have happened, including the change of hands in terms of land and property. How has all of that worked out, David?
Yes, and indeed there've been many changes over those 125 years, both within Whiteway Colony and in the wider world, of course. Like you say, in the very early days, people did follow, you could say, quite extreme forms of showing their views. So they tried to live completely without money in early days. They lived communally. They shared everything, including clothing as well as food. It's written in the notes that a stack of men's underwear was kept washed and folded, ready for whoever would next need to put it on. So they, so it wasn't just the land that was worked communally, but also all kind of other
also
other
the underpants.
Yes, also the underpants. Yeah. Now that phase didn't last very long, it has to be said, for a number of reasons. But after 2 to 3 years, the idea of doing everything communally like that was found to be too difficult, and the colony evolved to an area which was more, well, certain things being shared, but with everyone having their own plots of land, their own homes, and their own clothing as well, but coming together for all kind of communal enterprises. And that's when the colony really started the way of managing the land, which is still used today, simply referred to as use occupation. It just means that a member of the colony would be allocated a small piece of land for them to use and occupy, and this would be where they would build their house, where they would grow their leeks and turnips, where their children would play in the garden. But then there are also parts of the colony land which are not allocated to any individual or family, but which are used for shared enterprises. So, we have a kind of a park, sports field, you could call it. We have obviously common roads. We have a hall where you came to meet us for our celebration. So there's certain areas like that. In fact, going back over years, there were areas where crops were grown together as well, but that doesn't happen today. But that was done in the past. So a mixture of individually allocated pieces of land, which are for either one person or a family group, and then keeping other common areas which are for communal enterprises.
So how do you as a collective, because you will remain a community, how do you make those decisions? Because I obviously did a bit of reading before seeing you today, so I understand that it was the original founders. There was about eight sort of founder members, or eight founder family members. No, not family members. Members of the group. But you've now got around, is it 60 houses? So you must have it must have expanded somehow. How was all of that negotiated? How do people decide, how many people live here? What's our capacity? Which bits are communal and which bits aren't?
Yes, well, all of that evolved over time. As you say, in the very early days, there were less than 10 individuals or couples, family units, small units, and over the years, the colony welcomed more and more people. Back in the early days, they would welcome everyone just to come along, and as long as they would contribute something. And indeed, if you read some of the early reports, even those who didn't contribute anything were welcomed and looked after. That didn't last that long,
No, I can imagine.
But then what happens gradually is that as the colony got bigger, more formal meetings had to take place. So originally these would just be small gatherings in someone's front room, and following the principles that we were talking about a few minutes ago, the idea of a meeting was to reach a consensus about something that had to be decided, not just to do it based on a majority, but to actually come to a consensus decision, including everyone. And that takes a lot longer, it can do anyway, but the philosophy was that was worth it, and that would be that's the way it was done. From the 1920s, we had our own colony hall, which was built by volunteer effort, and the meetings took place there. That was necessary as well, because we had more than would fit in someone's front room. So having a community hall was useful. And gradually, more formal procedures were brought into meetings. So the idea of having a chairman for the meeting, for example, that didn't exist at the beginning, but then gradually they would say, let's have the chairman, who was just elected at each meeting. Didn't always have to be the same person, but you choose a chairman in order to facilitate the meeting and make sure everyone but had a chance to be heard and so forth. And from the certainly from around the 1940s, a lot of people came here who had experience, for example, in the trade union movement, in political parties like the Communist Party, other group, the Labour Party, I'm sure, and we're used to the idea of having minutes, standing orders, and votes and things like that.
Interesting how bureaucracy sneaks in everywhere, David, all the time.
Yes, it does. So we have but as I said, it's all evolved over time, and certainly for 100 years or so, we've been having regular meetings organised in different ways, and that still continues. So we have regular colony meetings, and this is where the decisions you asked about originally are taken. So these can be bigger things like allocating a plot of land, smaller things like approving the budget to spend on some materials to repair the hall or something like that. These decisions are all made at colony meeting, and that's an assembly that all colonists are entitled to attend. So we don't have a executive committee or something that makes these decisions. It's a general meeting.
And do you still work on consensus? Just for those listeners, I guess, who maybe consensus is a new phenomenon, I would imagine at some point we will cover consensus in its own right. But consensus is this idea of sort of devolved decision making, or at least that's my understanding. So it's not about winning, as in, 50% have voted for this, therefore it will happen. It's a much, I would probably describe it as a sort of a much more devolved, possibly decentered approach, where it's about finding a solution that will that everybody can at some level be happy with. It's like you might I don't know if you'd describe it differently.
Well, that's certainly what we aim for, and indeed I think you've given a good description there. We don't want the meeting to trample over the views of people who hold significant objections or reservations to something. I mean, luckily it isn't every month that we have to make such weighty decisions which are going to be like that, but yes, in chairing the meeting, although we do when necessary hold votes, we try to avoid that, and instead we talk around a subject, evolve ideas on a solution to whatever the issue is, and get that expounded at the meeting and talk around it, and then see if anyone objects to it, and try and then just take that. If there's no objections and everyone is reasonably happy with the idea, we then just take that as a decision of the meeting then, rather than having to have a formal vote. But sometimes we do need to have votes, but it would be the case that, for example, that a chairman would be ill-advised to take a voted decision as final if there was a significant number of votes against. And there's plenty of occasions in recent past I can think of where a vote like that has been taken, but the chairman will then say, well, okay, that's all very well, but it looks like this isn't clearly accepted by everybody, so let's go back and perhaps consider this again, and try and find another solution. That's what we try and do anyway.
Right.
So that's how we do these things, and the meeting's been through very many changes over the years. Everyone on the colony is welcome to attend. Of course, like any organisation, not everyone does attend all the time, but we do what we can to keep everyone in touch with what the meeting's doing and circulate information and things like this.
And so if somebody wants to join Whiteway? Because I know that there are, obviously Diggers and Dreamers has lots of communications with lots of communities, and some communities actively look to recruit people. But I understand that Whiteway, for lots and lots of reasons, is slightly different to that. So if I wanted to, can I buy a house in Whiteway? Is it possible? How would someone join Whiteway community?
Yes, indeed, that's something also that's evolved a lot over the years. So in the early days, there was a lot of land available, and the colony could find a corner of land to somebody who wanted to join and just allocate it to them, and they would then build their own house on it or bring a building or structure, which might not have been in the early days a conventional building. For example, somebody brought an old railway carriage to Whiteway. How they got it here, I don't know. But anyway, they were able to bring one and put it on their land and live in it. But gradually the land was more and more allocated, more and more gardened or worked by people over the years. You have to imagine how bare it was 125 years ago. Hardly a tree on this windy hilltop
Oh
on
my
the
gosh.
Cotswold Hills. Hardly a tree here. Very, very bare. So you could think of it almost as, sort of raw land available to do what you liked with, a canvas, a blank canvas. But increasingly it became not like that, of course. People moved here, they built their houses, they planted apple trees and plum trees and grew vegetables and kept animals and gardened it to make put roses there, and all the things that people love to do to make a home. So what that meant is that eventually, this is now back in the 1970s, I think, the plots have been allocated and reallocated and divided and so on. And community at that point said, well, really, we've got to the point now where, yes, we could carry on subdividing our plots of land to fit more people in, but this would then turn it into something more like a town than a country village. And the community at that time decided, that was it enough. And actually, the local council at the time, which of course planning regulations had come in by then.
Oh, of
no
course,
such
yes.
thing when
Yes.
the community started. Also was of the view that this was not an area where they wanted to see urbanization. So, continued addition of more and more properties. So it's not possible anymore for the community to find a piece of land and just say, okay, you can have that and put a new house on there. You have to use one of the existing pieces, and that means somebody else has to leave, and they then sell their house. So there's always a house there already, and they're not anymore falling down old shacks or railway carriages or things like that. Over years and years and years, people have built more substantial houses on the property which are more comfortable and so on.
I did notice that actually walking around Whiteway, it's quite it's just absolutely amazing to see that there are some houses that look like they might well be the originals, or at least very close to the original, and some that look extremely, well, if not modern, but there's people with electric charging EV chargers and solar panels and all of that sort of modern accoutrements. I was wondering about the planning. I seem to remember that there was something in the 1950s about a court case that went to the House of Lords. Is that
well, that's all to do with the status of the land.
right?
So, as I said, I think earlier on, from when the days of totally communal living ended, and we started with family groups or individuals having their own plots, the colony has operated this system called use occupation, where we allocate a plot of land to somebody, and they have to use and occupy it, but they don't own it. Somebody back in the 1950s decided to challenge that system by basically saying, well, we don't think this would stand up in court. I'm going to claim my piece of land, my plot allocated.
That wasn't very anarchist. That was very anarchist of them, was it?
It wasn't. So I'm going to claim this as my own property, register it as a freehold, and then I can, of course, sell it. That would have been their that was why they were doing it. They wanted to sell the land. They tried to do this, but the community opposed them. And it had to go to a land tribunal, which is the equivalent of the High Court for criminal cases. This is the High Court for land cases, and they found in favour of the colony because we've been operating this procedure properly. That's really the reason. We actually diligently manage and administer the land, which is all we say we do, and people who come here under those conditions. So it's not reasonable for them to then try and tear that agreement up. And
they were cheating, weren't they? They were trying to cheat, and it's quite it must have been very affirming to have been able to go through that court process and to come out the other side, sort of going, actually, no, this is correct, this is how it should be, and that people can't just come along and claim things, claim pieces of land. Yes. And then obviously that was the 1950s, and then obviously, when we look at the sort of the whole communal movement as a whole in Britain, we can't overlook the effect of the 1960s and 70s, sort of people looking for alternative ways of living and perhaps considering communal living in a way they hadn't before. Do you know whether Whiteway saw any sort of surge of interest around about 60s and 70s?
I don't. It's a very interesting question. I don't actually know if there's anything specifically of that time. We've always had new people coming, and certainly in the 1960s we were still making plots of land available because we didn't regard ourselves as completely full, if you want to see it like that. And there were new people coming who wanted this kind of lifestyle, although I know mainly a lot of people who came at that time were relatives of people already here. That's another strong thing at Whiteway that I did mention, actually, is the many multi-generational units, and have been for a long time, even going back 100 years. There were several generation family units where people would grow up here and then they'd want to have their own place here and bring up their children, and that's a strong tradition. And people who move away and then want to come back, and so on. So there were a lot of that going on in the 1960s and 70s as people's children grew up and then wanted their own family homes. Came back to Whiteway for that.
So just at the beginning of this, we talked about the fact that you've taken on the mantle as the community archivist. Diggers and Dreamers are quite aware that a number of communities tend to pass through history and lose some of their history. Things get boxed up and put in attics or sent off or things like that. And so having a community archivist is quite a valuable thing to have. Could you tell us a little bit about, well, firstly, what you've been doing, And secondly, maybe a little bit about the process, how you've gone about collecting and how you've chosen to save or preserve some of the community documents that you've got. Yeah, could you do that, please?
Yes, of
Thank
course.
you.
Yes, so one of the most important things we have, of course, here is our official records. So minutes of meetings and letters connected with the management of the land. This is a core part of what we do. So that's one of the most important things I've been concerned with preserving to begin with. Now, historically, when it started, such records were written in books, in longhand, joined up writing, and this has preserved a lot of information, but of course it's also difficult for people to get at. There's only one copy. That also means to risk of getting lost in some way. So one of the things I've been particularly involved in doing is digitizing all this information. So taking lots and lots of these old documents and scanning them or photographing them or using various methods to get them into at least some kind of digital format, which, yes, we've still got the original books. Books are great to look at. They can look beautiful and they're artifacts from a previous age, but it's useful to have the information in some kind of digital format. So for books, for example, what I've had to do, because you can't even spread these books out flat. They're bound books like old diaries or cash ledger type books. If you think of things like that in a leather binding, you can't even put them flat onto a traditional scanner like you might have. So what I had to do with those is spread them out on a table, and I had a camera over the table on a tripod, bright lighting, and then photograph each double page, turn a page, take another picture, turn the page, take another picture. So one book would have at least 100 pictures in it, maybe more. And those are all now stored in our digital repository, which we're not hosting ourselves on our own computer systems, but we've put these on a cloud storage platform. So that means, yes, it's looked after securely somewhere. We don't have to worry about backing up the computer or the computer failing or the computer itself getting damaged or stolen or something like that. That's being looked after by us. It also means I can make the information more accessible. Any colonist who wishes can have an account on this server. We do require a sign-in, because a lot of this information we regard as private to the colony if it's our own internal records. But any colonist who wishes can have a login on this repository, and then they can go on there and look at all this stuff.
That's absolutely amazing. There's I'm not aware of anything of that kind of organization in the UK. I do know that I think it's University of South Indiana, they have a similar type of repository that they have for different communities in the United States. Initially, I think it was set up around the sort of the Owenites and the New Harmonists, and that's hosted by basically the university and their library, which gives it that sort of longevity, as it were, so that they can put their holdings somewhere. So your collection is is available to your community members, is there anything that you're planning on making more publicly available?
Well, we don't have a definite plan for that at the moment. Really, my focus for now up to now has been to get all this information scanned and stored. So I've done all the meeting minutes and records that we've got. I've done all the records that we've made regarding the management administration of the land. I've also done a whole lot of other information that's just come my way for one reason or another. So things like old photographs or other documents. Yes, I just take those and put them in there. The challenge with a lot of this stuff is how to organize it, I would say, and how to make it so that people can find things that they want to look for. With things like meeting minutes and so on, there's a kind of obvious chronological way of doing it, which I've followed. And for more recent material, I might even have had that in some kind of digital format. For the past 20 or 30 years, people have been keeping records using standard off-the-shelf software packages, word processing packages, and I might even have the files for those, which means you can search for them. And for slightly older ones where they were typed or done on a computer, but the digital files were lost in the meantime, I've just got the printout. Well, at least with the printout, you can scan them and you can use a optical character recognition software, OCR, which will, in quotes, read the document and turn it back from an image into text. Not perfectly, I'll have to say, but fairly well. And that then gives you a readable text file.
So do you keep, so for example, I'm just imagining what you're describing now. If I wanted to have a look at some of the documents sort of pre-digital, then if I went into your archive, I could have a look at a photograph of the original document, the handwritten document, and then there's like an accompanying digitized, not translated, but recognized documents for easier reading.
Yes, a transcription. Yes, that's right. And that's not been done yet for all of the handwritten documents, because I haven't yet found a free software which will do a good job of transcribing handwriting. Now, I think probably even in the 2 or 3 years I've been working on this project, there have been great improvements in those kind of softwares, and I should have another look. And if there haven't been any yet, I'm rather confident that within the next few years, with the growth of things like artificial intelligence, software algorithms, and that sort of thing that we all hear about, that there will be something within a few years that would do a good job of automatically transcribing even handwriting. And then, I can come back and point that at these photographs and get it to make a text transcription.
Absolutely.
And the benefit of course, is you can search it, because somebody who's looking for information on a certain person or a certain topic, if they've got to read through hundreds and hundreds of pages of handwriting to try and find it, that's difficult.
That would be quite a phenomenal thing to be able to access, actually, David. That's quite amazing. And I also know that there are a number of other communities, not quite as old as Whiteway, but off the top of my head, I'm thinking, communities, maybe things like Brazier Park, where they've probably got handwritten entries and various paperwork and things. And this whole process would be a really useful thing for them to be able to have a look at and to think about how they might be able to use it for their community.
Yes, that's right. And, having the files stored in a cloud server, at least to get all the basics of storing the images of the documents, even if you don't have these transcribed things yet, but to get all the images stored and make them accessible via something that anyone can basically use, via a browser on a computer or a smartphone application. That's not that difficult today and not expensive either. There are many providers of cloud storage. It's not that expensive to set up a cloud storage and make it accessible to your community members.
So now I'm going to ask you whether you have found anything that you've found particularly, I don't know, quirky or interesting, or, through your digging around in the community history. Is there anything that stands out to you as an interesting find?
Well, yes, of course, there are lots of interesting old stories, but I suppose the thing that immediately springs to mind is one story from the 1920s, which I didn't discover. It had been discovered before, but I did dig up more material about it, which is when the government decided to send some undercover agents into Whiteway. So they recruited a couple of people, man and woman, and got them to pose as community members,
as anarchists,
but then secretly to provide information to the local police and the intelligence services based in Whitehall about what might be going on in this community.
Do you think that was that fear of communists, or
Yes, well, you have to cast your mind back to the time. This was just before the general strike of 1926, and the Russian Revolution, of course, was a very recent event then, only a few years before. The incredible upheavals in society following the end of the 1914-18 wars. There were lots of changes going on in society, and the government really feared that there could be a revolution here. And there were people, of course, putting that idea forward in society at large. There were people advocating violent revolution, and the community being connected to various other radical groups came under suspicion. In fact, according to the reports filed by these spies, some of which you can still find in the Public Records Office, if you apply to them, the reports are still there, despite the fact, by the way, that in the 1950s, some official had written on them, this stuff is no longer of interest, it should be thrown away. It never was, because of, I think, the typical bureaucratic reluctance to throw anything away. We'll just move it we'll just move it into a different drawer in the filing cabinet, keep it just in case. But anyway, according to their reports, they decided that the people living here had beastly morals, in quotes, which basically meant that some men and women were living together without being married.
Shocking.
That was the and there were things going on like a lot of vegetarians. There was folk dancing going on. Stuff like that, but nothing.
Beastly vegetarians.
Yes, but nothing particularly dangerous in that regard. So, although it was a sort of interesting episode, nothing that dramatic came of it in the end.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you for bringing that to the meeting. Right, so I guess we're going to start wrapping up now, and I was wondering if you might be able to, either from your experience of living at Whiteway community or as their resident archivist, if you might be able to tell us maybe one or two things that you've taken away from your experience or some learning points.
Well, yes, I mean, as regards living in the community, I think we've sort of touched on this already, but I come back to these ideas of tolerance and goodwill that were there at the very founding point, and there's something that we must not on any account forget. You know, occasionally there've been times in any community and in the country at large, one can see it, these things get forgotten sometimes. But making decisions by consensus is terribly hard, but it's worth it. And you have to tolerate people with different views from your own and be able to discuss and, where possible, come to terms with that. And that's something that we forget at our peril. So that's probably something I've learned on a small scale here in the community, and we should remember. From working as an archivist, well, it's capturing the information very important, but making this really available to everyone in a form they can use, that's the tough part. You're up against not everyone being familiar with the technology to begin with. That's one thing. So as archivist with my digital platform, I have to also be an IT support specialist to help people out when they can't log on or something like that, and particularly just helping people to find the information. That's something I think we need to work on more. So making some way of indexing or that kind of thing. And continually also, I think one of the things I'm trying to do now is bring the information out and hold little events or sessions for people where we'll get some of these old records out either digitally or physically and look at them together as a way of bringing them back to life so people don't forget about this stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to hearing even more about Whiteway in the future.
Well, thank you very much. I've very much enjoyed our talk today, so thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from Diggers and Dreamers, the go-to place for intentional communities in Britain. As ever, it really helps us if you like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget, you can find out more about communal living at our website, diggersandreamers.org.uk. There you'll find an online directory of existing communities and developing groups within the UK, plus interactive notice boards and information about our publications. One you won't want to miss is the Diggers and Dreamers directory, which has been referred to as the Communard's Bible for 35 years. And now, to play us out, here are the Spaceheads with their tribute to our old mate, Gerard Winstanley. See you next time.